introduction. Just another person trying to help in any way I can. And good morning to and good afternoon, because of the two different time zones. It is an honor to participate in this effort along with the Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies, the Constantine Cambanis Chair at Fletcher, the Fletcher Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy, the Department of International Relations at the National University of Political Studies and Public Administration in Romania, and the Institute of International Relations in Athens, Greece. I look forward, even though with all the technical situation, to a great week of seminar, of lectures, panels, and discussion at these critical times for America and the Eastern Mediterranean. The seminar, the sponsoring, I sponsored the seminar this week, will not only provide the opportunity for more than 30 students and 40 participants from 10 different countries to hear from several policymakers, academics, practitioners, politicians, and diplomats, but to also foster global citizenship. At this point in history, a changing America in a dynamic Eastern Mediterranean is the reality of 2021. Hopefully, by the end of this week, we will have a better understanding of the challenges and in exchange become more involved participants and citizens. I want to congratulate Professor Van Vakas for all the excellent work he is doing, and especially working tirelessly to organize and put this educational, informative seminar together. Thank you, Professor Van Vakas, to you and your team, Elizabeth, Konstantinos, and all the participants. Thank you very, very much. I also want to thank the participants and have an enjoyable and successful seminar, which I think it is. The morning session was very nice. I'm very impressed as well as pleased what I hear and working together. Thank you very much. Have a great seminar.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Danis. So we will be starting. Hello, my name is Natalie Gevorgian, and I would like to welcome you to the Winter 2021 George E. Danis Eastern Mediterranean Security and Diplomacy Seminar, IEMS in cooperation with the Constantin G. Karamalis Chair in Hellenic and European Studies, the Fletcher Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy, Department of International Relations of the National University of Political Science, Institute of International Relations, and Public Administration Romania will be hosting a one-week program of focused lectures, presentations, and panel discussions. The one-week program will bring experts from different regions in 3 sets of presentations and panel discussions aimed at assessing a changing America and a dynamic Eastern Mediterranean. The seminar will address the multifaceted intersectional issues that explain the significance of the Eastern Mediterranean in regional, trans-regional, and global terms by considering issues such as climate change, migration, energy resources and security, religio-cultural identities and soft power, public health pandemics, and inter and interstate relations. With country experts from cases across the Mediterranean basin, the Middle East and Caucasus, and the transatlantic space, the seminar will introduce students to historically grounded significance of the Eastern Mediterranean for contemporary U.S. foreign and security policy and for key global trends in the 21st century. Our presenters this week come from the different countries of the region, as well as backgrounds. We have a mixture of policymakers, diplomats, and academics. The full program is available once you register for the conference. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our speaker, Mr. Cambanis. Mr. Cambanis is an author, journalist, and senior fellow at the Century Foundation. He is co-director of TCF's Foreign Policy Program. His work focuses on U.S. foreign policy, Arab politics, and social movements in the Middle East. And I would also like to introduce our facilitator, Dr. Van Vakas, who is the director of the Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies at Emmanuel College. Before turning the microphone to our speaker, I wanted to let you know that I will act as the host of the event and will guide the Q&A, which will follow the 30 to 45-minute presentation. The duration of our program will be 1 hour and 30 minutes. I'd like to ask you to turn off your microphones and to use either the chat or to raise your hand for any questions. We will try to answer all of the questions. It is nice to have you all here, and thank you. Mr. Cambanis, you can start your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, I wasn't sure if Petros was going to say something first. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this today, and it's wonderful to not have my name mispronounced. So thank you for that. And it's an interesting timing to be having this conversation. And I took this as an opportunity to try to think about some of the longer term trends that I've been studying, advocating about, analyzing, and looking at in really the last 10 years of American foreign policy. My focus has been on American foreign policy in the Middle East and really specifically the Levant. And so I've been, very deeply steeped in what's happened in Iraq, what's happened in Syria, but of course I've dealt with the wider context for 2 decades now. And the prompt of addressing what is happening with American foreign policy in this region now, really, it's timely, and it's more complicated than at first it seemed. And by the time we arrive at today, it's very striking to be talking about this at a time when democracy in the United States is under direct threat, certainly more so than it ever has been in my lifetime, and I would say arguably as much under direct threat as it's been at any time since the American Civil War. For quite a while now, many of us have been pushing for a sort of change in the analytical and policy distinction that gets made between domestic and foreign policy. There's, I think, for far too long, a very artificial sense that these are 2 independent spheres, and this is captured most simplistically in the dictum that politics stop at the water's edge. But the idea is essentially that what happens at home is not material to what countries, especially powerful countries, do abroad beyond their borders. For, again, at least the latter half of the Cold War, and certainly after it, I think that distinction has long ceased making sense. The policy of powerful states is as much, the domestic and foreign policy is as much intertwined as economic and security policy are intertwined. So I think serious policymakers and serious scholars long ago stopped trying to understand these things in distinction, right? So the questions that we ask ourselves is, how are economic interests driving security policies, or how are domestic political concerns affecting foreign policy or international policy? Until now, though, the way in which policy is made and also the way in which it's explained still tends to support this artificial distinction. I will be trying in my thinking today to see what we can learn when we start sort of assuming interactivity between all these spheres rather than thinking of them separately. I also try to understand American foreign policy by looking at actions in tandem with rhetoric. I think both are important. This is also one of these, one of these areas in which some analysts make a distinction that I think is more obfuscating than clarifying. I think it's quite revealing to look at what governments say about themselves and their values and their intentions, as well as to look at their actions and practices. You don't gain as much if you look at just one or overemphasize one over the other. These are deeply mutually reinforcing. We know that words and ideas matter. And again, we've seen as stark a reminder as we need in the events that have unfolded in this country, the United States, since the election in November, where words and online conversations have very quickly translated into destabilizing violence in the first violent transfer of power after an election that we've had in I would say arguably since the founding of this country. So we know with a lot of relevance how much words and ideas matter, and we know as well that what happens inside this country affects what this country can do abroad, and the first place that's going to come up is in democracy promotion after January 20th, where the United States is going to have a lot of trouble with a straight face trying to talk about exporting democracy or promoting democracy in other fragile countries, of which a club of which the United States is now a member in good standing. With that framing, in mind, let's turn to the question of the changing America in the dynamic Eastern Mediterranean, and what, if any, is the new American era in foreign policy that we're witnessing. So, in my view, we are in the middle of a generational shift in the United States' approach to foreign policy in the world. This is a change that has its roots in the immediate decade after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, and which really began in earnest with America's overreaction to the September 11th attacks. So by this, in this narrative arc, we're looking at, in 2020, we're roughly in the 20th year of a global transformation, which has been largely catalyzed by the United States, but not by any means a transformation that is controlled by or dominated by the United States. And the United States is now entering, let's say, its second generation of defining how it intends to pursue power and interest in this changing world that it helped set in, that's in a wave of change and increasing anarchy that was to which the United States did a great deal to contribute, but which the United States is now as much a recipient as it is a driver. The key elements that I see in the current U.S. approach to the world, elements that I think are arguably new, are first of all a real climb down from having a rhetoric of values around America's self-image and stated policies. Secondly, a very pronounced decision to no longer try to control the world order, but rather to opportunistically benefit from it, like smaller world powers used to do in the era in which the world was a bipolar order or a unipolar order, and finally, what most characterizes this era is a lack of formally agreed upon rules. If you look at the way international orders work, they're always dominated by anarchy. There's never been such a thing as a firm and clearly defined static world order. So all the concerts and orders that we've seen, certainly since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, the ones in the sort of Western dominated period of history. And so I'm not going to take a 2,000 or 3,000 year vantage point and look at previous eras in which China was dominant and so on. But in this modern half a millennium or so, the rules have always been dynamic and disputed, but there have been periods of greater clarity of rules and greater clarity of the balance of power, and periods of more competition and dynamism in which those relationships were being redefined. So we are preceded by a period, a brief historical period of about half a century at the end of World War II, in which most of the most important powers in the world had a more or less clearly defined sense of the limits of their power and the agreed upon methods to adjudicate disputes. That meant in certain contexts, like in Western Europe, powers were expected externally to adjudicate their disputes peacefully using institutions, rules-based institutions, and diplomacy. In those contexts, it was believed that economic integration would produce greater political integration and also wealth. At the same time, in weaker zones of the world, the great powers were agreed that violent competition was okay. And in those cases, the belief, sort of post-domino theory, was that the instability would be exported to places like Korea, like Vietnam, like Africa and Latin America, where proxy wars unfolded. And the belief was that such instability and human cost in death, displacement, poor health, excess mortality, and so on, would be borne by citizens of weaker powers. And that is what the international liberal order looked like in the last 50 years of the Cold War. It was in no ways idyllic. It wasn't particularly humane, especially for the half or more of the world that lived in zones that were acted upon by America and the other great powers. But it was, to some vantage points, predictable. And the theory of the case within America's allied community was quite compelling and was good for its members in a way that is now changing. So to briefly sketch out what I mean, the alliance that the United States assembled to fight the Cold War, which included primarily NATO, but also the OSCE and other more ad hoc alliances with either treaty allies or like-minded partners, was considered a security community, an economic community, and a values community. And critics are always quick to point out the elements of hypocrisy in this policy, and there are certainly many, but the premium on rights and rule of law and due process was real, and it undergirded a tremendous amount of growth, not just in stability and prosperity, but also well-being for those polities that joined this bloc. So without exaggerating how excellent this order was, and without claiming that it wasn't rife with racism, imperialism, abuses of this rule of law, and so on, the overall arc and trend in this period was towards more of those public goods, and a belief that the more equity and equality and due process that went to American citizens and to citizens of partner countries, the better off all those countries would be in all realms. And the appeal of this vision was evident in trends like growing immigration to the United States, in growing wealth of the US and the European countries that flourished under its security umbrella, and the sort of body of rights and ideas that we saw in the Helsinki agreements and in the for a time dominant discourse of human rights and international justice. So there was a paradigm that I would say peaked in the 90s, in which people who weren't delusional, believed that the world was on a long arcing path towards more peace, more stability, more justice, a greater and greater number of fully vested stakeholders in the order of rights and laws. And there was a belief that democracy was a better system to live under, and a more durable, stable system that generated world peace and world wealth. This view didn't, of course, shape every American action in the international sphere, but it was the bedrock philosophy of America's strategy. And it genuinely shaped policy debate. It certainly shaped America's image of itself. And I would say in many, but not all cases, was a sort of indispensable element of major foreign policy gambits. America couldn't undertake a military intervention abroad in the 1990s unless it could frame it as being part of a quest for democracy and justice. Now, plenty of people can argue that those arguments were either disingenuously deployed or flawed, or that those interventions didn't accomplish what they were purported to accomplish. But this was the core of what American foreign policy was doing. Now, that began to change toward the end of the 90s, when the United States, absent a sense of overpowering international threat in the form of the Soviet Union, began to believe, as I think most Americans still do today, that there isn't really a global threat to the United States. And so the critical mass of American power, in effect, if not in rhetoric, turned inward and began to act on the assumption that whatever happened in the world, for better or for worse, wasn't going to affect what happened in the United States that much. So whereas previously we had competing schools of how America should manage its international relations, by the late 1990s, we began to see that there was one camp of people who believed that America should continue to expend resources and engage in the outside world. And that camp included militarist hawks, democracy promoters, international liberals, and like the whole spectrum of different approaches to managing international affairs. And they were, in effect, one camp which was pro caring a lot about foreign policy, and the other, and I think more dominant school, was one that did not see a significant interest in spending blood, treasure, or even attention in managing the world order and managing America's foreign affairs. So by the late 1990s, we already had, Bill Clinton was unable to get his own government to support the International Criminal Court. It was clear that all the momentum towards more deeply intertwined international institutions, ones that would summon genuine sharing or pooling of sovereignty, those were dead letters in the United States. And this is ahead of the curve of Europe, which took another 5 or 10 years to realize that it too had reached the limits of its sovereignty sharing trend in the EU project, and it became very clear that we were not going to get some kind of more powerful world government under the supervision of the UN or its constituent institutions. We were not going to get international justice in which powerful countries would willingly submit to the rulings, to binding arbitration or binding rulings by some international body. It became clear that the United States was not going to support such a project. And in retrospect, it might have been naive to ever think that was possible, but in the 1990s, I was not alone in believing that powerful countries, including the United States, would think it in their interest to subordinate some amount of their sovereignty to an international order, because the benefits in security, stability, wealth, predictability would be so great that they would be worth small but marked surrenders of autonomy and sovereignty. That's how I saw it then. What followed was not that. What followed was a very marked and sudden shift towards opportunism by the turn of the millennium. And then after 9/11, a naked and really dominant turn towards short-term pursuit of interest. So several things happened right away in the response to 9/11. One was a full-scale militarization or securitization of almost all American policies. Again, this is something that transcended 400 domestic policy. The United States invested a huge amount of resources into empowering the government. So after decades of debate about should government, should resources to government be starved so that the government becomes weaker and weaker, or is government good? After 9/11, there was a bipartisan leap to just give huge amounts of power to the government. The Department of Homeland Security was created, a huge surveillance apparatus was created, the Defense Department was hugely expanded, the executive authorities of the presidency to unilaterally make decisions about war and peace without consulting Congress was dramatically expanded. We've had dozens now of wars since September 2001 under the authority of the AUMF that was passed by Congress in the immediate wake of the 9/11 attacks. So we had this huge systemic shift towards security and militarization being the modes of pursuing all policy interests, and an almost wholesale and historically incredibly quick abandonment of the principles of international partnership, international alliances, multilateral institutions, and even the rhetoric of rule of law being the bedrock of America's practice in the world. All those tenets, which I would argue were really preeminent from 1945, if not sooner, through 2001, those fell away in rapid succession. And by the spring of 2003, when the United States was preparing to invade Iraq without any international backing, on the basis of knowingly false intelligence, in contravention of America's own institutional checks and balances and values and laws, by March of 2003, the United States had decisively positioned itself as a different type of power than it had for the preceding half century. I think a lot of those actions were taken with a short-term perspective in mind, without a lot of thought by their architects about how this would transform the world order. But transform the world order they did, and I would argue greatly for the worse. But the way this unfolded, I think, caught many of its own architects by surprise. I think the policymakers who sought to take advantage of what they saw as America's short-term opportunities to either create more security or create zones of control for itself in that period after 9/11, I believe they thought that America would be able to continue to enjoy the benefits of that, the sort of order and comedy it had created. So I think they thought they could, as the sole and dominant superpower, that they could start breaking the rules that they had set out for others, but continue to enforce those rules for everyone else. And I think the practice was that most of the time the United States would continue to abide by these rules of the road, but sometimes it wouldn't, and it believed those rules would remain intact. And in retrospect, that is a, clearly that's not what happened, and it's clear in retrospect that that was unlikely to happen, because once the United States opens the door, for example, to completely walking away from the Geneva Conventions and the laws of war, how can it expect Russia, China, and others, Iran, Saudi Arabia, you can create a long list of violators of these laws since 2001 or 2003. How can they expect these other countries to honor rules of international conduct that it does not follow and does not honor? And this and thus began a period that has accelerated to where we are today, where every power at every level feels entitled to relitigate the limits on its conduct. And we are not equipped to deal with this amount of change and of violation, and yet we do have to deal with it, because this is the world we live in. We have, first of all, the international order and institutions are so weakened that there's no check on state behavior coming from the United Nations and its institutions. They remain important repositories of expertise. They remain important reflections of our aspirations for predictability or accountability in the world order. And for some of us, they remain the sole remaining avatars of a hope for some kind of global governance institutions. But in no way do they have binding power over even the smallest of governments that are willing to break the rules in pursuit of their interests. And certainly they have no say whatsoever over the behavior of non-state actors and hybrid actors. So we have an international group of laws and institutions and norms that is, if not completely irrelevant, is largely sidelined. And we have dominant powers that are much more closely matched than they were in the 90s. So America's relative share of power has declined, China's has grown, Russia's has grown, the European Union is ensconced as an important but never determinative player, because it just lacks executive decision-making power. So the European Union is important as a source of regulation and a market and a standard-setting body. It is nowhere close to being important as a security actor or a determiner of war and peace, or of the demilitarization of international relations. In the United States, we have a very distinct consensus, and this is not the consensus of the foreign policy elite, but it is the consensus, I believe, of the government, that the United States does not want to invest resources, financial and military, in upholding regimes, and I don't mean ruling parties in other countries. I mean international regimes of law and practice that only indirectly benefit the United States. And this is, I would say, a sort of catastrophic kind of short-termism, but it has been in evidence through 3 presidential administrations. It grew alarming and worse under Donald Trump, but it is not a Trumpist phenomenon. We've seen this turn beginning with George W. Bush. Under Obama, we saw a sort of steady drift towards reaction and frustration at having to manage international affairs. Obama was interested in the international stewardship of matters like climate change, as we saw in the Paris Climate Accords, but not in the critical realm of security, of war and peace, without which we can't do things like fight climate change. So the most alarming norm to collapse under Obama was the taboo against the use of chemical weapons, which was one of the few international taboos that had persisted since World War I. And it was a sort of wellspring of hope for those of us who were looking for ways in which international agreements and accords and norms could restrain behavior, because international agreements can't force states to behave differently, but they can create enough incentives that they do. And from the days of rampant mustard gas use in the trenches of World War I, we saw great powers and mid-sized powers, for the most part, not using chemical weapons. And that was something that was sort of proven by the breach, and that only in the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s, an atrocity. By 2012 or 2013, when Obama drew his red line about the use of chemical weapons in Syria, and then decided it wasn't that important to the United States to enforce it, and he let Bashar al-Assad go ahead with the use of chemical weapons against his own people. That was a very significant abandonment of the goal of international order, international restraint, and crucially, it was the action that enshrined in a bipartisan way the reality that the United States was no longer interested in promoting an international rules-based order, no matter how flawed or of limited effect those rules would be. So what we have now is a state of flux and competition, in which, as I said a minute ago, every power at every level is interested in relitigating its autonomy to act as it sees fit in pursuit of its local and regional interests. The most destabilizing manifestations of this in the Eastern Mediterranean are Turkey, Israel, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, but almost all the other powers are consequentially undergoing the same kinds of experiments and the same kinds of pushing, because they have been given permission by the United States and by extension the other powers that can, if they so choose, try to set rules of the road for international behavior, that all bets are off. There's no longer, for example, a price to pay for being overtly anti-democratic. So Erdogan, Sisi, and so on, dictators who work with some patronage from the West, which supposedly has rules against supporting dictatorships, have learned that they no longer have to even pretend not to be dictatorships. And this is the kind of development that 15 or 20 years ago, Americans began to argue didn't matter to America. It wasn't actually important to us whether Egypt is ruled by a dictator or whether we're making a security alliance with a dictatorial authoritarian monarch in Saudi Arabia. And this is an argument whose implications are unfolding today. The dominant view in the United States is that the United States can secure itself and get wealthier regardless of the state of governance in its allied countries. And frankly, now we've learned regardless of the state of democracy and accountability internally, domestically inside the United States. I would argue that that's not even true short term. It's definitely not true long term. And I would also argue that having rights and having due process are themselves collective goods that are valued by states and citizens. So if you were trying to quantify everything, as political scientists often try to do, you would have to include a lot of points for living under a representative system that has accountability and due process, that's something that people are willing to give up a certain amount of wealth in order to have. But today, we are in the middle of this process, which cannot be stopped. It's gonna have to play itself out to resolution, in which the United States and the other now nearly equally critical players will have to reach a new equilibrium and a new modus vivendi. And it genuinely might be a much worse one than the one we had before. You know, there are those who argue that a multipolar world with more evenly matched spheres of influence will ultimately be a better place for more people in the world. And I think that's possible. I think ultimately what is most important is predictability, and it's predictability and knowing how power struggles can be resolved that reduces the amount of war, displacement, famine, and other public ills that are ultimately the things that are most important to not for the world to not experience. And we're not, I think, anywhere close to having a kind of stable and predictable set of pathways for adjudicating global power disputes. The Biden administration is and I see your messages, Natalie, and I will be wrapping up in 4 or 5 minutes from now. The incoming Biden administration is very much geared towards restoring what it understands as the pre-Trump practice of international affairs. And while that will be certainly an improvement over the incompetence and chaos of Trump's management of foreign affairs, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, where he's been a tremendous disaster strategically and on a human security level, but restoring American foreign policy to 2016 is absolutely inadequate to the moment in which we find ourselves. We have undone the assumptions of the post-Cold War order. We can't return to them. We have to build something. It can be in the image of what came before, but we have to build something that is new and that addresses core challenges. For instance, the challenge of creating international rules while accepting that the United States can no longer dictate them as it could when it was the unipolar power, building or reestablishing cooperation on climate change and also on laws of war, while working with rival great powers who do not share America's former stated values. And frankly, if the United States is going to try to restore some notions of global cooperation and rights and values as the basis of policy, it has to implement those things at home, which it has not. We can't go to Egypt and talk about the torture of political detainees when we've done nothing to curtail white supremacist violence by renegade, unaccountable police for decades, for the entire half a century since the passage of civil rights. We're not enough better than the police states in the Middle East to go and promote to them or remonstrate with them about their erosion of rights and dignity for their citizens. And that is frankly a tall order and perhaps out of reach in the next 4 or 8 or 12 years. Personally, I hope that's not the case. I hope that what we see is a relatively speedy return of the franchise and of the rule of law to the citizens of the United States. We are going to witness a deepening rather than a correction of this kind of this kind of global instability. And what America's role has shaped up to be over the last 20 years is that of any other large power that is pursuing a very narrowly defined set of wealth and security interests with little concern for how it affects the wider world order, and little concern with how in the long term such approaches will redound back on the United States' pursuit of its interests. And that is why, it's hugely consequential that the Trump administration recognized the Western Sahara as part of Morocco. This is the first time that the United States has recognized overtly a territory acquired by force, and its annexation by a country that annexed it by force. This will have consequences for Israel and Palestine. It's going to have consequences for many other territorial disputes, and I would argue is going to be one of many engines for further violent conflict, as the U.S. invasion of Iraq was. And ultimately, this will poison American efforts to pursue other interests that it sees. And what we'll get in the end is some, in the next 20 years, the negotiation of a world order either that's based on this kind of unending anarchic friction, or we will get the creation of some new set of international rules and practices that tries to do a better job than the 1948 order did. And that order, as we recall, built on the failures of the League of Nations, and did for a time do better with limits. So I will close with that read. I hope these sort of musings and historical thoughts are useful to you as you look at the specifics of different crises for U.S. foreign policy and different crises that are coming to a climax in the Eastern Mediterranean region. I look forward to your questions and comments and reactions.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. I think Natalie's trying to get back into the conversation. We had some more technical difficulties. I think it was I really like the survey of American foreign policy that you gave us. I'm going to make a couple of comments of the things that struck me, and then I see that there are some questions that are lining up, so I'm not going to take too much time. And one of the things that I'm struck by is the fact that we constantly talk about American foreign policy in the way that it's evolving outward. And I like the term that you say that you mentioned about the generational change in American foreign policy. Because the American foreign policy of the 1940s and 50s, as it develops, it really comes from a generation of the 1920s and 30s and all the way up to the 1940s. So I'm thinking of like the Kennans and the Morgenthau's and the Dallases that really built American foreign policy in the 1950s and 60s and beyond. And today, when we talk about American foreign policy, I just can't stop but think of like the Iran-Contra, or even the hegemonic moment that we had in the 1990s. It's almost like an American foreign policy built on hubris, really playing itself out in the last Clinton administration and the first Bush administration. So from the indispensable nation all the way to 2004, there seems to be an American foreign policy on this hegemonic moment. And also the fact that we are, I agree with you on this transition right now, but the transition has to do almost, you presuppose that we are going towards a multipolar equilibrium rather than some kind of like refinding an American footing, resetting the world or recasting the world in an American footing. Like we listened to Mr. Hoi Yi earlier, who obviously was an Undersecretary of State, and the hope is with the coming Biden administration that the U.S. will be back. And what that means is, re-energize those institutions, which, I think you correctly point out, it undermined tremendously in the early part of the 21st century in the UN and even the climate conversation. So my initial take on your response, maybe if you give us a response, is to what extent are we sort of like wishfully thinking that the U.S. will be back in its role of setting the rules of engagement, or are we really on uncharted territory as far as a new type of an equilibrium with all these other actors around at the same time?
Thanks, Petro. I think the United States will not return to a position of dominance. That was a brief historical moment, and when you look at history, what's been consistent in the United States is that as a continental power that has never really had to worry about being invaded by its neighbors, or because it's surrounded by these oceans, it doesn't have to care as much, frankly, about the world as pretty much all the other major countries do, because of geostrategic realities. The consistent trend has always been more distance from the world. So this period of the sort of 50 years of engagement that wasn't hegemonic, or wasn't entirely hegemonic, that was an aberration historically. It was a good one. There's a lot of things I liked about it, despite its flaws. But once the 80s and 90s rolled around, once it became clear that the U.S. was winning the Cold War, and they started shifting towards the sort of hubris and hegemonic behavior. And again, there are people who argue that that was always the dominant thread. I think evidence shows that there really was a sort of a pullback, where for a period America was willing to forego maximalist aspirations in this place or that place for what it saw as a greater good, that it saw as being in its own self-interest, right? It wasn't doing this for charity. America didn't prop up Europe after the war for charity. They did it because they thought it was good for American power and wealth. But that was a win-win. It was a long-term, foregoing short-term profits for long-term investment and gains. The same kind of thing that makes for good business. So that was an exception, and we've reverted more towards this norm, which is the sort of idea that, hey, the world can fall apart and it doesn't really matter for the United States. And I mean, think about the moment when millions of people were sailing these boats across the Aegean, and then later across the Mediterranean, and dying by the hundreds, arriving by the tens of thousands, and walking across Europe. And here's Europe, which didn't rise to that challenge well, right? I mean, that was a catalytic moment for Europe, and a really major, massive test. One can imagine the America of 25 years ago would have jumped in at that moment of crisis to exert moral leadership, to deploy money to help the border states, it could have promised to resettle hundreds of thousands of people the way Canada did, right? There are all kinds of things that a superpower could have done that would have made that crisis unfold differently. And instead, the U.S. sort of said, let it burn. And this was Obama as the United States, right? This was Obama's government, which was, not isolationist in flavor, and which was involved and engaged. I think that shows. So that's a crisis that didn't pose a direct security threat or direct economic threat to the United States. The United States just sat it out. That is, I think, a harbinger of the type of approach that we'll see under even a reasonable American presidency, right? So a post-Trump America that's governed by competent people is likely to make choices like this. And when it comes time to set new rules, I think Americans will come into the conversation kind of like Britain did for the Brexit negotiations, thinking that it can call shots, and it will find that it cannot. It will find that it is a very important player in a multi-part negotiation in which there are other very important players as well. And the United States will retain, I think, military dominance or a military edge over other powers for several decades to come, but it's already lost the economic dominance that it used to bring to the table. So I think what we'll get is a sort of America-heavy reimagining of the world order, but not an American steered or American controlled one.
Great. I think Dylan is going to take over as a host. So Dylan, the floor is yours.
Yeah, excellent. So if you do have questions, do leave them in that Q&A box. You can also try using the raising hand function. I see we do have some questions lined up, so I'm just going to lead into those. So we have Nikolaus Bakirtsis. Thank you very much, Mr. Cambanis. If I understand correctly, the U.S. cannot easily lead by example on international level anymore as a result of its internal issues regarding the rule of law and human rights caused by Trump's presidency. Do you believe that the American comeback on both the domestic and international affairs arena can happen simultaneously, or that the U.S. needs to address its internal issues before focusing on foreign policy?
Well, so there's no luxury of ignoring foreign policy, right? I mean, the world continues and the crises continue. So I think your question hits on one of the problems, which is that the United States is still one of the most important figures, especially in crises in the Middle East. And so it will have to respond to the things that are happening. It will have to respond to the crisis in Nagorno-Karabakh, the crisis between Turkey and Greece, the crisis that Iraq is currently undergoing, the Yemen war, and other pressing things that haven't happened yet, but that are going to happen in the next 6 months. So it's going to have to respond to these things before it's had a chance to right its own ship. And the way that will play out, I mean, so there are details which are important, but which we can't foresee. But the thing that remains a major handicap on the U.S. is that it cannot make important foreign policy decisions anymore because of its internal domestic political paralysis. So the reality since the 90s is that no major issue can win 2/3 support in the Senate. So we do not pass important international treaties on the matters that are of most importance to us. So when Bill Clinton couldn't even put the ICC, the International Criminal Court, to the Senate for ratification, the Paris Climate Accord not ratified by the Senate, the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement, not ratified by the Senate, because there's no way in hell you can politically get the votes, and that means you can't make binding foreign policy on important things anymore. And that is the level on which, until and unless the domestic ship is righted and we return to being a coherent power that can make decisions and get both its political parties to support them, will be making foreign policy that by executive fiat and unmaking it every time an administration changes. And that is, by the way, how some countries make foreign policy, but it is tremendously destabilizing, and it means that we're not going to get that equilibrium that will end this historical chapter until and unless the U.S. has a coherent polity.
Thank you very much. We also have a question from Margaret. Could it be argued that the U.S. in a way delegitimized democracy by invading Iraq and Afghanistan in 2001 and 2003, respectively, thus leading to a new rise in acceptance of authoritarian regimes?
Absolutely. I mean, delegitimized democracy is a big way to put it, but I happen to agree with that. I mean, there's lots of dimensions to this kind of devaluing of democracy, and the most obvious one is promoting democracy elsewhere. But I would argue that by the legal framework or lack thereof with which the United States invaded Iraq, and then its practice during the occupation of so many aspects of how it treated the Iraqi state and Iraqi people, that not only did the United States sort of eliminate the plausibility of promoting democracy in other states, but it actually poisoned its own democracy. And I think literally and directly, many of the visible declines that we've had in civic life and security in the United States are blowback from the way we deployed our military personnel and contractors, and encourage them to flagrantly disregard our own rules of conduct of war, our own rules of engagement, the way we normalize torture of detainees and torture of just regular non-detained citizens of these countries we were operating in. We created hundreds of thousands of highly trained people that came back to the United States with zero regard for human life and the rule of law, and with a deeply enshrined practice of racist violence. And this is something that was happening in plain sight, and many people sounded the alarm about in the 2000s, and I think were dismissed partly for political reasons, partly because of a failure of the imagination, and partly because it was maybe too dark to contemplate the result of this, because it was impossible to stop it once it was underway. But the reality is that, you know, these people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th and were talking about lynching elected officials in the United States, many of them were veterans of these wars who absolutely saw their chain of command endorsing this kind of behavior in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and other places as well. So there's a bigger element to how this has hurt democracy, and I think it's something that we're going to be unpacking for a long time.
Thank you for your answer, and especially recently with the whole pardoning of the Blackwater individuals. That would be a very interesting thing to follow up with later. I do have a question from Mary Kay Harity. Despite the U.S.'s geographical position, is it possible that the explosion of cyber capabilities in major adversarial countries like Russia, China, etc., not only cybersecurity but in trade affairs and such, will decrease an isolationist mindset among U.S. policy makers?
I mean, I would say that the policy making elite on the whole is less isolationist than sort of the country's center of gravity. You know, the people who are involved in making policy, like the people who are involved in international finance and in really any business, not just international business, those people are a natural constituency for remaining engaged in the world, because whether, you know, through values or through their policy interests or through their security practice or through the things they have to do to make them towards paying attention to what happens in the world, having rules for conduct and so on. So I see it more, I mean, you know, so I'm not talking about like the sort of bozos in Congress who sort of position themselves as isolationists, but the sort of policy making class, they're all pro engagement. You know, the military is, all the security elements of the security state, as problematic as they are in other ways, I think they're very committed to staying plugged into the world. But what they're contending with is a political environment, one that punishes any serious constructive investment in dealing with the world, other than through like outright militarism, and two, a political climate that's both short-termist and sort of fact averse. So it's very difficult to promote any policy that doesn't operate on a 2 or 4 year cycle. So that's why we've had a little more movement on hard security matters, where, you know, if there's a proposal on the table that can somehow be linked to short-term counterterrorism security, which in my view is an unhealthy way to define all our priorities. But policies defined as such have found support. Policies that are about more nebulous goals of establishing rules of conduct or promoting security through cooperation and collaboration that doesn't have some kind of direct measurable impact on the electoral calendar, those policies don't find support. And I'm not sure if it's because of the isolationist tendency or because of our system's increasingly obsessive orientation towards electoral politics. But in either case, my concern is that unless there's a real fundamental ground shift in how both major parties view the importance of being engaged in the world, that we're just not going to see policies made at all on even very obvious needs like protecting our government's computer systems from foreign hackers.
Can I just jump in and ask you a question?
Please.
I want to thank you very much for this tour d'horizon, and I wonder if you would care to elaborate a little bit more on the future of the transatlantic relations.
You mean between the United States and Europe, or?
Yeah.
I mean, I think Europe is internally in an unresolved crisis, and for a long time there was a hope, which I certainly shared in, which was that the EU's model of pooled sovereignty would act as a mobilizing force for good for America's domestic politics and also in general for international relations, that we would see in the EU's deepening approach to governance a model for incremental collaboration, incremental deepening. We don't have to surrender to world government to recognize that this is a better way of doing things, and it would be the way forward. That promise was broken after Europe's failure to act in solidarity after the financial crisis in Europe, and then during the migration crisis. So we found that Europe is unsurprisingly susceptible. Then what the crisis that Trump precipitated over defense costs and over Europe's inability to act as a unitary actor on the global stage, that wasn't just a Trumpist crisis, right? I mean, Trump, as with everything, executed this in the worst possible way, right? So, if there was a constructive or a toxic, nihilistic way to breach a disagreement, absolutely instinctively he would do it in the most scorched earth damaging way. But that crisis had been coming to a head for decades. And it's an uncomfortable truth that the United States subsidized Europe's better social compact by paying its defense budget. As a pro-European dual citizen who lives and works in the United States and admires the European project, it's an uncomfortable truth that Europe just kicked down the road indefinitely. Like Europe was put on notice in the 90s and just ignored it, and they just figured America would pay forever. And even a non-crazy America would say at some point, why should Europeans have better unemployment insurance and a better living standard because we're paying for their defense? And it's very expensive. And Europeans love to criticize American militarism while enjoying the umbrella that it provides. And that's an ugly problem, because the most obvious solution is for Europe to become worse rather than for everyone to become better, right? So the path of least resistance is for the US to precipitate a crisis, and then for Europe to either give up social goods or to engage in the same kind of wanton militarism that has distorted American foreign policy. and more friction than there has been in a long time between the U.S. and Europe over these competing priorities. And so what we'll get with the Biden administration is certainly like a return to the benefit of the doubt and to goodwill, right? I mean, Europe wants a good relationship with the United States and sees in Biden a sane, professional internationalist who values Europe and won't be insulting the EU and its institutions and every government in Europe every chance he gets, the way Trump did. And that's important. I mean, that's not nothing. That's a big help. So we won't be seeing just arson as the method, as the default MO. But the actual disagreements are difficult. There's not an obvious, in my view, there's not an obvious fix for the transatlantic relationship. And I think we don't have good answers for questions like, what's the point of NATO? Like, we screwed up NATO big time when we went for expansion in the 90s and antagonized Russia. And I see both sides of that argument, but in retrospect, it was the wrong thing to do. It shifted NATO from being a tightly wound defensive organization to being one that was logically perceived by Russia as an expanding offensive organization. And, I mean, I'm pro-democracy in the Ukraine, but incorporating the Ukraine into NATO and Europe is obviously going to lead to conflict with Russia. Those were bad moves. And we haven't resolved what we think about those things in the United States. And I think Europe is in deeper trouble than it's ever been, because now you have these kind of crazy right-wing governments in Poland and Hungary that are further exaggerating an existing a rift between European states that want to essentially retrench versus those who want to deepen the continental collaboration. So I haven't answered your question, but I guess I'm worried. I'm worried for Europe, and I'm worried for the relationship. I still think it is the only and the sole natural alliance in the world that connects values, views of how to govern, and views of how to do business, right? So these are critical things that unite Europe and the United States and don't unite them with any other region in the world. So they will naturally be partners, if not lockstep allies, in this next stage of renegotiation.
All right, thank you so much for your answer. I have a question from Teresa Vuhosevich. Thank you, Mr. Cambanis. In your opinion, what could be the best or least effective method to reestablish global cooperation in these times?
What would be the best method to establish global cooperation? I mean, there isn't a method for it, and it's not going to happen soon. We have to see internal coherence so that then these countries can negotiate some kind of enduring new way of coexisting. So right now, the only coherent actors are the most malign. So Russia and China have internal political coherence, and they bring a unified position to the international realm. Europe does not. The United States does not. And the smaller countries that play a major role as financiers or spoilers or regional powers are for the most part in a state of extremis as well. So I'm thinking Saudi Arabia, I'm thinking Iran, I'm thinking Modi's India. So right now we are going to have a continuing long period of this kind of anarchy. There isn't something obvious to be done about that beyond understanding and describing it. There's lots of There's lots of incremental things that can be done to try and reduce harm in one case or another, but none of those things will lead to the kind of transformation that we need. From the United States' point of view, we're going to have to see a resolution of this debate over whether the United States should be a shaper or an opportunistic taker in the world order. I hope we see the United States ending up for the former, and coming back to an idea that it is important and worthwhile to invest in these international goods, both for moral reasons and also practical reasons. But we could just as easily see the United States at the end of the next 10 or 15 years come to a consensus that the United States should operate in the world system the way Russia does, looking for benefit and opportunity, looking to consolidate control in its near neighborhood, and influence where it can and it's far abroad. And I think that would be a bad outcome for the world, but there's no idealistic or values-based reason to just assume that we'll end up going for good. I mean, the sort of famous mistake of the Obama presidency was to glibly assume that the moral arc of the universe bends towards good. It doesn't. The universe is not a sentient being. It doesn't have a morality. If we don't push it towards good, others will push it towards bad. There is no default towards a good outcome here. And similarly, there's no default towards a bad outcome. Unfortunately or fortunately, the United States isn't in charge, right? So what the United States does in the next 10 or 20 years is important. It is not the sole determination of what happens.
All righty, thank you very much. So I have a question from Maria Mujahid. Would you be able to elaborate more on foreign policy, in particular on the Arab world? What are your thoughts on Biden's plans for Palestine and Saudi Arabia?
So this is an area which I know a lot about. I like the question. I think overall, the Biden administration's plans for the Middle East are decent but inadequate. The headline is restoration in a region in which restoration just brings us back to a different period of catastrophic problems. So with Saudi Arabia, what the Biden administration plans to do is try to distance itself from the worst misconduct of Mohammed bin Salman, reduce or end direct American complicity with the war in Yemen, engage in some kind of performative censure of Mohammed bin Salman for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and to show that we are not in lockstep with the excesses of this regime, but they're very intent on not creating a break with the Saudi regime. They view the Saudi regime as a critical partner, as a indispensable long-term partner of the United States, and as a major weapons purchaser. So they're not interested in courting or risking an actual break with the Saudi government. And in my view, that guarantees more or less business as usual, right? So Saudi will probably tolerate a mild scolding. They might petulantly, engage in a theatrical response to that as well. But it's going to keep the partnership with you. So if you can just weather a year of Biden, refusing to talk directly to the acting monarch, you'll get everything you want. They'll probably take it. And what we'll get is a continuation of this really, one, destructive, destabilizing authoritarian approach by the Saudi monarchy, and two, this maximalist confrontation that Saudi has been driving with its Gulf neighbors and with Iran, which is Like the truth is, these countries have to share the region they're in. Saudi and Iran have to cooperate in the region. They're going to both be there. Iran is a problematic power, and we're not getting rid of it. It's a problematic power that's going to be there. So we can engage in maximalist confrontation with it indefinitely, at great cost, or we can acknowledge and force America's partners in the region to acknowledge that they've just got to find a modus vivendi with Iran. What we're going to get is the bad former, which is that Iran, Saudi, and the Gulf states will continue to feel hyper empowered to confront Iran, and Biden is going to try and do this thing that's not going to work. He's going to try and restore the JCPOA, and at the same time keep America's partnerships with its spoiler allies, Saudi, UAE, and Israel. These are the allies that undermined and eventually undid the original Iran deal. And it's kind of like that other question about what do you do first? You can't get a deal to stick with Iran unless you get these American allies to support the deal, and they're not going to support it. And America either can't make them or isn't willing to expend the actual political capital to make them support it. And so what we're going to get is a restoration, and it's going to be bad. It's going to be Netanyahu's Israel doing exactly what it was doing before with greater cover, because it now has normalized relationships with 3 Arab countries that had formerly not had open diplomatic relations with Israel. And the Gulf will, having temporarily set aside its internal rift, will go back to beating the war drum against Iran with tacit support from the United States, which is delivering tens of millions of dollars billions of dollars of weapons to it. And the policy is going to be one of trying to manage this rather than dominate it, and that will be healthy because there's going to be a sort of reduced assertion of how much America is implicated in control of these events, but the events are going to be bad.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Cambanis, for all your wonderful insights. We really appreciate you coming on this morning and enlightening us. We really appreciate everyone tuning in. So we do encourage you all to come at 1 o'clock. We will be doing an entire lecture on cyber security in the region. So
2 o'clock. 2 o'clock.
2 o'clock.
I see Mr. Danis. Mr. Danis, do you have a question?
Yes, I do, and in some ways, I want to thank very much Mr. Cambanis, for an excellent explanation and insight of what is happening and where we are and where we're going. I do feel that if the U.S. continues to retreat its position, I see the totalitarian regimes to expand, and the Russia and China to take over the world and eliminate the human rights, citizenship, and democracy as we know it, as we have lived it so far. Is there a solution? And one of the things that I think of is if the U.S. would ever find and elect a quite visionary, but also very hard bargaining leader to do several domestic issues, to minimize its borrowing, to eliminate or to curtail the importing and without exporting resources to China in particular, and work and look at the future as a carrot and a stick.
I mean, I think you're right that we're at a really frightening historical moment where we can't take democracy for granted anymore, right? Where authoritarianism is on the rise all over the world and inside the United States. And, you know, it wasn't long ago, it was 100 years ago, these issues were being contested also around the world. And, you know, I think you're an immigrant to the United States. My parents were immigrants to the United States. So many people came to this country because, even recognizing its flaws, they saw something they believed in this system. It's correctability, it's accountability. So
Precisely.
whatever is wrong with it's better than other places because its dynamic tends towards accountability, towards representation, towards justice. These aren't just hollow words, right? These are ideas that created opportunities and ways of life that many of us found appealing and better. I think that is the one thing that can save democracy in the United States. And if it does, I mean, we can't do anything about it in the world unless it is revived at home. If it is revived at home, then we have a great deal of things we can do. I mean, you mentioned one, which is reducing the sort of enabling elements of the economic interdependence with authoritarian regimes. That's absolutely one of the tools in the toolkit. Another is remembering that economic equality and prosperity for workers is a bedrock of rights and liberty, not an irrelevant side issue, and realizing that international partnerships carry their own good. Like if we marginalize Hungary and tighten our embrace with France or, you know, whichever country is still practicing democracy, those are meaningful signals to people in the world as to what pays. You know, does it pay to be an autocrat or does it pay to be a democrat? And so those are some of the ways that we can put our thumb on the scale for liberty, for democracy. You know, we took it for granted in the United States. And by the way, Europe has done the same thing.
Precisely. And this is where I think the sad part, and I'm an immigrant, came here for the same reason that you point out. And now I'm fearful of where we're going and how is my family, my children, grandchildren, but also the world was looking to the United States as a beacon of hope and democracy and equality to some extent. And it requires a great deal of political capital for someone to really re-energize citizenship and democracy and the country to be able to really relight the beacon of humanity.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all again so much. Again, tune in for 2 o'clock for the lecture on American cybersecurity and cybersecurity in the Eastern Mediterranean region. Thank you all very much.